Welcome back. In this lesson, I will show you how to build the presentation layer of a repository. You earlier created the sample business model in the business model mapping layer of the repository. I will now show you how to create the presentation layer of the repository. The presentation layer exposes the business model objects in the Oracle OBIEE user interfaces so that users can build analyses and dashboards to analyze their data. To build the presentation layer, you will have to perform the following steps. Create a subject area, create presentation tables, create presentation columns, rename presentation columns, and reorder presentation columns. To create a subject area, you right-click the white space in the presentation layer and select New Subject Area to open the New Subject Area dialog box. On the General tab, you will enter Paint as the name of the subject area. And then you click OK. The Paint subject area is added to the presentation layer. To create a presentation table, you right-click on the Paint subject area and select New Presentation Table to open the presentation dialog box. On the General tab, you will enter Time as the name of the presentation table and you click OK to close the presentation table dialog box. The Time presentation table is added to the Paint subject area. To add additional tables, you will have to repeat the same steps that you used to create the Time presentation table. So I'll go ahead and right-click on the Paint presentation subject area, choose New Presentation Table, and type Product. And then we'll click OK. Then we'll do the same thing for the market, New Presentation Table, and we'll type Market. Note that this is the manual method for creating presentation layer objects. For simple models, it is also possible to drag objects from the business model mapping layer, and I will demonstrate that by dragging over the fact table onto the Paint presentation subject area. So you achieve the same goals. You have to rename the fact table manually in order to be consistent in our naming convention. When you create presentation objects by dragging from the business model and mapping layer, the business model becomes a subject area. The logical tables become presentation tables, and the logical columns become presentation columns. Note that all objects within a subject area must derive from a single business model. The next step would be to show you how to create presentation columns. So to do that, we'll expand the default time dimension table, and then we'll select all the different columns that exist in this table, and then drag them over and drop them on the presentation table. The dragging and selecting columns to the presentation table in the presentation layer is a good practice because it allows you to only pick some of those tables that you use in your analysis. If there are hundreds of columns in a given table, you do not necessarily have to drag over everything. You just pick the column. For example, out of all the columns that were previously selected here, I could have just chosen 3 of these and then drag them over to bring them to the time presentation table in order to achieve my goals of providing only specific columns that my users need for their requirements. Now we'll repeat the same steps for the product dimension table, for the market dimension table, as well as for the fact table. So I'll collapse these so that we can see only the tables that we want to expand, and I'll go ahead and expand the product dimension table and select all the columns. and drop them on the product presentation table. And I'll also collapse this table, and expand the market dimension table in the business model mapping layer. Select all its columns, drag and drop onto the market presentation table, and then I'll collapse this table. And you will notice that the fact table in the presentation layer was dragged over from the business model to the presentation layer. And because of that reason, all the columns that were held in the fact table, or which are held in the fact table, were also brought over. So we do not necessarily need to copy these columns again and then drag them and drop them onto the fact table in the presentation layer. I've just demonstrated two ways in which you can bring over objects from the business model mapping layer to the presentation layer of the repository. If you wanted to name one of the columns under the fact table, let's for example say you wanted to rename the column name, you would right click on this icon and notice that this area is grayed out. In order to be able to rename this table, you will have to uncheck the use logical column name. So uncheck that, and we'll just call it name 1, and then we'll say OK. So this changes the name of the fact table column to name 1. The point here is that you can change object names in the presentation layer without impacting object names in the business model and mapping layer or the physical layer. So if you wanted to change any names in the presentation tables, you could go ahead and make those changes so that they become meaningful to your different users once the whole repository is exposed through the analytics. Now that we've demonstrated how to bring over the columns from the business model mapping layer to the presentation layer, as well as drag over objects from the business model and mapping layer to the presentation layer, we wanted to demonstrate another way in which you can reorder presentation columns. Now to do that, in the presentation layer, we would like to go ahead and double click on the time presentation table to open the dialog box. Then we want to click on the columns here. If I wanted the Greg month ID to appear as the first object, you would have to select it here, and then you can use the up arrow to move this object up in the hierarchy like that. And if you did not want to keep it as the first item, or you wanted to keep it the second item after you realize that you had moved it to the top, you would use the second arrow down to move it one notch down. You would then click OK to close the presentation column dialog box and confirm that the presentation column is ordered in such a way that made more sense to you and your users. At this point, we are confident that we've done everything that we wanted to do in the presentation layer, and we want to take it additional steps in checking and validating the repository. Now, once you finish building an initial business model and you now need to test and validate the repository before continuing, you begin by checking the repository for errors using the consistent checking option. Next, you load the repository into the Oracle BI server memory. You then test the repository by running an Oracle BI analysis and verifying the results. You then finally examine the query log to observe the SQL generated by Oracle BI server. Congratulations, you've just completed building the presentation layer of the repository.